This is Curious Minnesota, a Star Tribune project that sends staff from the state's largest newsroom hunting for the answers to great questions we receive from you, our readers. We're here to answer everything you want to know about the state's people, places, and culture.
Welcome to Curious Minnesota. I'm your host, Eric Roper. We've talked previously on this podcast about Minnesota's dominance over the flour milling and lumber industries in this country. Today, we're talking about another industry that was once heavily influenced by Minnesota companies, computing, specifically supercomputing. A handful of Minnesota companies once designed the fastest computers in the world. But as with flour and lumber, Minnesota's reign as the supercomputing state wouldn't last. Reader Ted Adams asked Curious Minnesota why Minnesota's computing industry largely faded from the spotlight, despite the growth of the computing industry overall. We're talking today with Evan Ramstad, who wrote about this topic for Curious Minnesota. Well, Evan, thank you so much for joining us. So first of all, you're going to be our new business columnist starting on January 1.
That's right.
And when can people read your column?
We on Sundays and Wednesdays, online and in print. Yeah.
All right. Very exciting. And so you graciously joined Curious Minnesota to do this story. Basically, the question was, what happened to our computer industry in the Twin Cities? So let's set the scene here for people who are less familiar with the topic. And I was less familiar before we got into this. Why should people care about Minnesota's computer industry? It sounds like we were kind of a big deal for a period. And we love here on this podcast talking about the exceptionalism of Minnesota, even if some of our industries are no longer as prominent as they once were, whether it's flour milling, lumber, or computers.
Right. Well, Minnesota was the epicenter of supercomputers in the late 60s, 1970s into the 80s. And still had, with Cray, the dominant supercomputing company, into the 90s even.
And these are the fastest computers in the world?
Fastest and biggest computers in the world, correct.
Wow.
They often cost millions of dollars, sometimes over $10 million. There's not a lot of them in use. There's not many customers for them. They are still made today. They're made differently, but they are still made just by a few companies. And you hear from time to time, some research lab, government research lab has now bought one and has just accomplished this feat.
You're talking about supercomputers generally.
Supercomputers generally, correct.
Right.
But, it's used by the Weather Service, uses supercomputers, right, keeping track of data on every place on the globe, right?
And as we'll talk about, the personal computer sort of supersedes this later in this story. But so there's a distinction between these two types of things, essentially.
Right.
So we have to go back in time, as we do with these stories. So in this case, we're going to go to just after World War II is where this tale begins.
Right.
What's sort of the impetus for Minnesota getting into the computer business?
Well, computers back in the war were human people. People.
Okay.
They were people who made the calculations to try to break codes.
Okay.
And they were known as computers because they were computing.
Oh, so these are people whose title is a computer.
Was computer.
Oh, got it.
Exactly.
All right. Yeah.
And you can see this on some old movies, from time to time. And it was actually in the UK where the first mechanical computer was used to break a German code. And in the US, code breaking was the first thing that a mechanical computer was really sought for. Even when they were making the atom bomb and stuff, they were still doing math with slide rules and sheets of paper and stuff.
Yeah.
They were not using mechanical computers. So after the war, some of the people involved in code breaking in the Defense Department...
Minnesotans?
Well, no, they were not Minnesotans, actually. But a Minnesota businessman who had been a military contractor heard that these code breakers wanted a place to work and needed a business, needed some money around them because they wanted to try to build machines to break codes in the way that the British had, and that was clearly what America needed to do in the Cold War.
Okay, because now we're talking about the Russians, right? we need to break those codes.
We got to worry about a whole new prospective enemy. So this businessman name was John Parker. He had been building gliders in St. Paul that were used by the Army Air Force in the war. And now he has this big factory. He doesn't know what to do with it. He's looking for other uses. And he hears about these code breakers who need a home. So he says, come to Minnesota and let me build a business with you.
Right.
And so they did. And the first years were kind of rocky because there's not a lot of, they were innovating, they were trying to get the machine to work, but they were also looking for other revenue, so they went into all kinds of other businesses.
And this is Engineering Research Associates?
Correct, that's the name of the company.
Maybe intentionally vague name.
That's right.
Because they're doing lots of things, right? Is that the idea? Okay.
Right.
But this is sort of the original company that ends up spawning the legacy of many companies.
In Minnesota, correct. From ERA, as it became known, there were two really important companies that came out. One was Univac, and the second was Control Data. And Control Data rose to become the biggest company in Minnesota. For many years there in the 1960s and early 70s, it employed about 20,000 or more people at one point.
Right.
And it was building not just supercomputers, but it was building mainframe computers, kind of the smaller computers that were sold, starting to be in high volumes in the 1960s to businesses and to governments and such.
And
but
so
IBM was the dominant maker of those mainframes, and companies like Univac and Control Data were kind of distant in third or fourth place with IBM leading.
But we were we were leading on supercomputers, but not mainframe computers.
Correct. Right. So to distinguish themselves, these Minnesota companies kind of took a step up and focused on the more niche market. But with the university here and with other resources around the Midwest, it was kind of a place that became a kind of a hotbed for this type of research and innovation, mathematics, and the budding discipline of computer science.
So why would someone need a supercomputer? These are like millions of dollars, right? These aren't cheap investments. Who's buying these enormous computers? They fill entire rooms. Right. What are they for?
Well, they're for doing calculations that required very intensive or lots and lots of numbers. And so in the early years, it was the military, and it was like the National Weather Service or the ancestor to the National Weather Service. And these applications were very specialized. It wasn't the kind of thing that any ordinary person would come across in their life.
Right.
It was the very, very start of people using machines to calculate and to understand things that weren't really possible before, because you would have to do so many numbers or so many repeated calculations over and over and over again to get the result you were seeking.
Okay. This is the other interesting part, is that there's lots of people in the Twin Cities who are literally manufacturing these things. I mean, we have a photo in the story of someone who's standing inside one of these original computers. There's a lot of stuff in there. But what was it like to work at one of these companies?
The workers actually building the circuitry were mainly women. What they were doing was running little wires from one sort of clip to another, right? They were creating circuits. And there would be a switch on either end to go on and off. And, calculations are made by the series of circuits going in a sequence on and off. And representing a character or representing a string of characters or a calculation or something.
Right. And why are they all mostly women doing this?
Because wires, they were small and fine, and the perception was that women had greater dexterity in their hands.
Interesting. Okay. But basically, there's manufacturing plants in the Twin Cities. I mean, is this thousands of people we're talking about?
Yeah, thousands of people. I mean, both Control Data and Cray actually had their largest plants not too far away from the Twin Cities, but in Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin.
Okay.
But there was manufacturing here, too. Yes, of course.
Right. Okay, so with any one of these stories, whether it's flour milling, logging, or now computing, we have to hit the apex. When do we hit our peak? When are we really hitting our stride as like Minnesota's top of the game here?
The early 70s, and with Cray, even a little bit later. Cray's success in supercomputing stretched into the 90s, really. But for Control Data and for Univac eventually gets bought and kind of merged into other companies. But Control Data's apex was in the 1970s.
Okay. So the question had to do with why we didn't keep up. And, it seems like it's a Kodak story where, we're leading an industry and then suddenly we're not really a big part of that industry anymore. So we have to start with a little company called Intel, right? Is that where this sort of story begins there?
Exactly. What our reader noted was he just wondered why these three companies would fall away at the moment when computers were really taking off. It's because of Intel, which took those big wired circuits, that the thousands of circuits that people were wiring together in these cabinets that filled up rooms, as you described. and put it into a small little chip, basically the size of your thumbnail, right?
Okay.
And
this is a microprocessor.
The microprocessor. Now, at the start, when they first did this in 1969, that microprocessor did not have hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of circuits in it, you know? And so it wasn't very powerful. It couldn't do very much.
What were they using it for? I mean, well, initially.
Intel's first customer, the customer that asked Intel to build this, was an adding machine company in Japan that wanted to build what we now call a calculator.
Okay.
And Intel's second little innovation or thought of what to do with a microprocessor was to create a digital watch.
Okay. So these Minnesota companies are like, yeah, this is pretty basic.
This is very basic, yeah. Well, there's not, and more importantly, it's very cheap.
Yeah.
Relative to, that adding machine calculator cost a few $100s to put on a desk, while Control Data and all these companies are selling computers for $1 million or more. And that's a lot more money back then than it is today, right?
Yeah.
And
but are other computer companies the ones that stuck around, were they starting to take notice, or does it wait till the advancement of the microprocessor a little bit?
It does take a few years. The first desktop computers from IBM were kind of the late 70s, early 80s. The first Apple computer was 76 or 77. You know, they could process words basically and do some math and stuff. But spreadsheets hadn't been invented for them yet, or no great business application. Nobody in the 1970s at Control Data or Univac or anybody was worried about losing a banking customer or a government customer to Apple or any forerunner of that personal computer industry.
But at some point it must have become apparent that they maybe had missed the wave, or something like that.
Yes, there were efforts to use microprocessors in what they called a parallel way, to kind of string them all together to try to get up to the level of supercomputers. And it just wasn't working at the time. It took years for that innovation to really, come along and stuff. And so it made no financial sense.
Right. It's a different business model.
Exactly. Exactly.
One is, what became common was sort of the computer that you and I might buy and the smartphone and stuff. And that's just a different business than what these companies were doing. They maybe had the option to pivot, but they didn't. It would have required a wholesale change in what they were doing, right?
We had a reader write a letter to the editor who compared it to the auto industry and said, there's the Ferraris of the world, and then there's the Toyotas of the world. And the Control Data's and Cray supercomputer and Univac, what they were doing was kind of like Ferrari kind of level, very specialized, very expensive type of computers.
Okay. So one nice thing about writing about recent history is that a lot of people are still alive who lived through this. And also there's a lot of nostalgia and loyalty to these companies. And a lot of them weighed in on the comments of the story. I mean, there were more than 200 comments on this story, and a bunch of people also emailed you. So what were we hearing out there from people? I mean, it was just interesting to see. One of the commenters noted how interesting the comments were.
Yeah, the comments were kind of better than the story.
I don't think so. But people should check out the comments for sure.
I mean, I love it when something like that sparks dialogue. And that's the power of mass media at times, is to, spark a community discussion like that. It was lovely to see. And I think what a lot of people were doing was kind of recollecting the joy, the ebullience of being part of something that was at the cutting edge, so exciting. It was a time when there's a lot of money in those companies, and it was like so unique. The state of Minnesota, until this moment, its businesses were agriculture and mining and lumber and finance. We had banks in the two cities, right? And this launched a whole different realm. I mean, it helped spawn the computer science department at the University of Minnesota and other colleges around the state.
Which had a role in the creation
of the internet. And still today, the U has its own fab in it for kids to learn how to make chips and such.
And you also talk in the story about how we are still a leader in the medical technology field, and that sort of has its legacy in these companies to
Absolutely.
some degree.
It was the same entrepreneurial zeal. It's the same investors and finance people who are looking at the computing industry in the 1960s who are suddenly like, hey, what can electronics do in healthcare? And that helped fund what is now, one of the leading med tech industries in the world.
Right. And so Are these companies just totally gone, or is there some relics out there or some vestigial parts of them?
Yeah, nothing ever totally goes away, in business. People find ways, even as a business fades away, the assets that are worthwhile, that have value, find their way into other businesses that get sold or resold or what have you. And, we have 2 chip manufacturers down near the Mall of America that both got their start making chips for control data. One is called Polar and the other is called Skywater. And actually, we also have one of the direct descendants of control data software called Ceridian, CRM, which is near where the control data headquarters used to be, down near the Mall of America.
Oh, so it's a big Bloomington thing, right?
All out there around the Mall of America is where...
So you can go shopping and take in some computing history.
You can take in some computing history. Yeah, the former control data headquarters is now office towers for health partners.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Okay. Well, Evan, this is so interesting, and we're all very excited to read your column, and so I'm sure you'll be writing on topics like this and other things,
Yeah,
right?
Business tales and controversies and tensions and a little bit of nostalgia like this, too, for sure.
Awesome. Well, Sundays and Wednesdays, right?
That's right.
Perfect. All right. Thanks so much, Evan. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thanks.
Okay, that's it for today's show. As always, we want to hear your questions and feedback at curious@startribune.com. And a big thanks to Matt Gilmer, who recently began editing this podcast. We hope his help will allow us to bring you more shows in 2023. And if you're liking this show, please tell a friend about it. We really appreciate your help spreading the word. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to Curious Minnesota. We want to hear from you. Ask questions and read more stories online at startribune.com/curious. Our show is recorded at the Star Tribune's headquarters in beautiful downtown Minneapolis, and our music is produced by Matt Gilmer. If you like the show, please rate us on iTunes or leave a review. And until next time, stay curious.